So I have a legit question towards socialists and communists. Not people that I label as such, but people who self identify as these two ideologies. People who go on Twitter with the hammer and sickle in their bios, people who have the black and red flag, people that legitimately call themselves anarchists. I understand a lot of things. Like, I understand that the ideology is about seizing the means of production, abolishing private, not personal property. I understand these things. But what I don't understand is that despite the fact that the ideology is tailored to fight against the wealthy, the bourgeoisie, the 1%, why is it that you guys have a special place in hell? Like, the thing that you hate the most right now seems to be the landowners. Like, this is what I genuinely do not understand. And you don't even discriminate. Like, you do not discriminate, from my personal experience, between a landowner that is a millionaire and he's got an entire company that rents out property versus a landowner that just has one apartment. I have not seen this discrimination. Maybe there is, but I personally haven't seen it. No, I like during the last couple of months, I see this burning hatred on Twitter, and even on Facebook, people are encouraging others not to pay their rent, and they're trying to organize people to gather up to force others not to pay their rent. And it's like, do you understand that you're literally playing into the hands of the millionaires by doing this? I'll explain in a bit. But first of all, let's look at the difference between landowners, and maybe you can give me a solution to the problem that I'm going to propose. Because believe it or not all landowners are born equal. And I will give you the example of my aunt. And I know most of you will say, well, it's a cherry pick example, but I think it's such a common example that almost everyone that listens to this video probably knows a person in their life that is in the same situation as my aunt. So my aunt starts off with a one-room apartment, a very tiny apartment that I presented on this channel, a communist matchbox apartment, like we like to call them here. And when she married my uncle, she moved into his house. So now she has a different place where she lives, and she has an extra apartment. What should she do with it? Should she just keep it? No, she decides to rent it out at the minimum price per market, so that usually students that come into my town from abroad and want to study at university can have a cheap and affordable place to stay. And she uses that extra money in order to pay the utilities at her uncle. Now, the question is like, why doesn't she sell the apartment? Why does she rent it? Well, it's because she doesn't know how the future is going to be like. For example, if the relationship with my uncle would turn for the worse and she would want to divorce, she would be out of a home. So she keeps that in that particular situation. Or my uncle had a previous marriage. So if he passes away, then the people that, his relatives and the family members from the other marriage could claim in the will that they want that apartment. So again, like, my aunt could be homeless. So she's keeping this particular place for the future. And I know so many people that do the same. Like, they have a place, they get married, they moved somewhere else, and now they have an extra place that they rent out. So remember when I said that when you do rent strikes or these types of, like, you encourage people to not discriminate. Like, literally, if you happen to be in a place and you're paying rent, just stop paying it. Doesn't matter if it's a company, doesn't matter if it's a person like my aunt, just stop paying it. The reason you're helping the billionaires is because what would happen if all the rent just dries up? Eventually, especially with the economic crisis coming up, my aunt might actually have to sell that place because she's going to go, well, like, we can't afford to pay the bills, we can't afford to pay our mortgage, so I have to sell my apartment and help out. Who do you think is going to buy the apartment? Seriously, like, who do you think is going to buy the apartment during the middle of an economic crisis? Is it going to be your average Joe? No, it's going to be millionaires and wealthy people that already have businesses where they just loan property to other people. They're the ones that are going to get very cheaply new property during this economic crisis. And what do you think happens with the person that's having the rent if the owner has to sell? I'll tell you this. It's a lot more easy to have a conversation with my aunt and explain to her, look, I can't pay for the next 2 months because of the shutdown. I know, like, can we come to an agreement? Can we come to an understanding? It's a lot more easy to do that than to come to an understanding with a big corporation that just deals with renting property to people. Not to mention, like, I never understood, like, this level of disgust specifically for the landowner. Like, this level of disgust doesn't exist for the banks. For example, like, I'm looking at the people with the hammer and sickle. Like, I'm pretty sure now that I bring it up, you all hate the banks, all of you. I'm 100% convinced. But you do not vocalize that unless I mention it. Like, you constantly vocalize the disdain towards the landowner. Again, you do not discriminate between a private individual and a big corporation. And you do not have the same disdain to the banks, which do the exact same stuff, because it's like, oh, the landowner is a parasite. Like, he doesn't do anything. He doesn't do anything. He just sits there and he's renting a property and it's just making him money. What do the bankers do? Isn't it like the same thing? Like, they just give you money and then you have to pay them extra. But, you know, like, it's with the bankers, it's a lot more complicated. I'm just overly simplifying it to the bare bones of what their profession should actually be like. But, like, all the people that hate the landowners, they do not understand. First of all, they're not making that much money. And secondly, you have to also take care of the property that you are renting out. Like, for example, my aunt is actually considering not to rent out the property anymore because of the property damages that are happening. Like, there were so many cases where they would rent out to a couple of students and they would have a big party there, and then the neighbors start complaining, and then the certain damages can appear, like the washing machine could be ruined, or someone dropped the television, or, you know, the walls need repainting because there were literally footprints on the walls, you know, like that, those types of things, which again the owner has to fix. Now, I know it's really easy to say, well, all owners are evil, owners don't do that. It's like, well, my aunt does it. And when you want to have like this general strike and force people not to pay, which by the way doesn't happen in my country, but I'm seeing it on the internet and I'm thinking, well, you know, if my aunt was in New York, she would get problems with these people. And not to mention, like, you are purposefully hurting the relationship between the tenant and the owner. Because it's one thing when the tenant goes to the owner and tries to have a heart-to-heart conversation and says, look, this is a little bit of a difficult time for me. I've been laid out of a job because of the quarantine. I can't pay for the next 2 months. Usually, like, you can come to an agreement, you can come to an understanding. They're human beings as well. They understand this. But if you're like going to be a twat and you're going to be like, screw you, I'm not paying, lulululu, what you're going to do? The law is on my side. Like, the law said, you know, for the next couple of months I don't have to pay or whatever. Then the owner is going to be vindictive. And they're going to take advantage of that. Like, sooner or later, they're going to have you in a tight corner. And then the owner will say, well, lululu, what you gonna do? The law is on my side. So, like, the advice that you give to people in order to be spiteful towards their owners is a really bad advice. You know, it's a lot better to try to negotiate, to try to communicate like human beings. But that's the thing. Like, I don't think you guys see the owner as a human being. Like, that is literally the problem. And it's really fascinating, especially in Britain. Like, in Britain, the problem isn't the landowners. The problem is the foreigners. Racismus, absolutely. Like, the people from Qatar, people from Saudi Arabia, people from China that are investing money into British property. And they're just buying stuff, and they're not renting it. They're not doing anything with it. They just have it. Why? So that in the future, when the market explodes, when there's a huge demand for property, then they can sell it. Those are the real problems. And you're not even talking about it. You're not even addressing it. Not to mention, like, how can you explain that a country like Britain with negative birth rates is having such high prices for property? Like, why is it that the price for property isn't going down? Because, like, if the previous generation managed to make do with X amount of houses, and the next generation is smaller in numbers than the previous one, why is it that the number of housing, which remains the same, doesn't become cheaper? You know, you need to ask yourself that question. I can't give it to you due to YouTube's terms of service, but you figure it out. You try to connect the dots and figure out, like, why is the reason that... Because I get, like, why a lot of leftists I think I get it, are pissed off at landowners because a lot of them are students or people that have to pay rent, and they do not understand like why do I have to pay, or whatever. But here's the thing: like if it wasn't for the owner renting, if people would just stop renting property and just hoard it, and why would people hoard it? For two reasons. Number one, they don't know the future, so when they're in a financial pickle, then they sell it. And usually it takes like an economic crisis or something to convince them to sell it. Or they keep it for their children. Like if I have two properties, right? What do I do with them? Well, when I have kids, my kid already has a property. That's how a lot of people think. So if you're against the idea of renting, people will just hoard these properties and just keep them. And then you as a student will find out that you don't have affordable places to stay. Like seriously, what is with this hatred towards the landowner that I do not understand? Is it like maybe because of the fairy tales you read with the boyar and the peasant? Like no, seriously, like I need to understand. And what is the same hatred for the banks? Those are my two questions. But no, like I keep saying, like socialism is controlled opposition for the wealthy because your rent strikes benefit the wealthy. The people that have millions of dollars in the banks and they have companies that rent out property left and right, they're not going to be really that affected because they're going to take the loss from their own pockets. And then when the people start, the average Joe that does get affected starts selling his property, they're going to buy those property as well. And then they have a monopoly in your town. And then they can start setting the prices and fixing whatever price they want. But anyway, right, let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys in the next video.